The finality of it was the cold. Not the cold of the October wind snapping at the corners of the town hall, but the cold in Mr. Gable's eyes. There were chips of slate, hard and flat and empty of all warmth. He stood on the steps of his own mercantile, a fortress of timber and glass that owned half of Providence Gulch, and passed sentence. Ilara, his son's widow, was to be cast out. He pressed 20 silver dollars into her palm. The coins were cold, too, each one a tiny, heavy death. Liam was a fool for buying that worthless scrap of bluff, he said, his voice low and serrated, meant for her ears alone, though the whole town was watching. A bigger fool for marrying you. This is the last of my charity. The deed is in your name. Now go to it. The injustice was a physical thing, a hot stone in her throat. Liam had been dead 6 months, taken by a fever that burned through him like a wildfire. In his life, he had been the heat in her world. In his death, his family's chill was all that remained. They had tolerated her while he lived, the quiet girl from a poorer territory. But now she was just a burden, a reminder of the son who had defied his father. Liam had used his own money, saved from 3 years of trapping, to buy the bluff plot. He had dreamed of building a small house there for them, away from his father's suffocating influence. It was their secret, their future. Now it was her exile. She looked at the faces in the small crowd. Pity from some, the soft, useless kind that turned away quickly. A flicker of triumph from others, who had always seen her as an outsider. Brant, the trapper, leaned against a post, a smirk playing on his lips. He thought he knew the wild, and he knew no lone woman could survive a winter on the bluff. The deed felt like a joke in her hand, a piece of paper describing a wind-scoured patch of nothing topped by a single, derelict railcar, abandoned years ago when the company went bust. $20, a worthless deed. The clothes on her back, sturdy but worn. And Boro, Liam's dog, who now sat at her feet, his grizzled brown head resting on her worn boot. He was all she had left of her husband. The dog whined softly, a low rumble of distress, sensing the shift in the world. He looked up at her, his amber eyes asking the question everyone was thinking. What now? Ilara did not answer them. She did not weep or plead. The hot stone in her throat hardened into something else, something solid and unmovable. She turned her back on Mr. Gable's cold stare and the whispers of the town. She did not walk toward the eastern road, the path of retreat. She walked straight into the mercantile, the bell above the door announcing her entrance with a sharp, defiant jingle. The air inside smelled of salt pork, canvas, and oiled steel. She bypassed the fabrics and the canned goods, her boots echoing on the wide plank floors. She went to the back wall, where the tools hung like relics of a forgotten faith. With methodical purpose, she took down a good felling axe, its head a pound of gleaming, sharpened steel. She selected a shovel with a sturdy ash handle. From a wooden cask, she counted out a pound of square-cut nails. She carried her selections to the counter, where Mr. Gable's younger son, Thomas, stood watching her, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. She laid the tools down. The total came to $17.50. She counted out the silver coins, the metal clinking with cold precision on the wood. She scooped the remaining $2.50 back into her pocket, gathered her tools, and walked out without a word. The act was a declaration. She was not fleeing. She was going to work. The journey to the bluff was a 3-mile walk that felt like 100. The wind was a constant thief, stealing the warmth from her shawl and biting at her exposed cheeks. The weight of the axe and shovel was awkward, unforgiving. Boro trotted beside her, a silent, furry shadow. The town fell away behind them, its wood smoke and false security swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape of rock and sky. The land grew harsher with every step. The gentle roll of the valley gave way to a stark, upward climb. The trees thinned, becoming gnarled and stunted, clinging to the rocky soil. The path she followed was little more than a game trail. Liam had walked it many times, his heart full of plans. She walked it once, her heart a cold, heavy lump of necessity. And then she saw it. The bluff. It was worse than she had imagined. A raw edge of granite and shale, it jutted out over a deep ravine, exposed to the full fury of the northern winds. And there, perched on the edge like a metal coffin, was the railcar. It was tilted at a drunken angle, half of its length buried in a landslide of rock and dirt. Its red paint was almost entirely scoured away, replaced by a deep, leprous rust that streaked its sides like old blood. The windows were shattered, gaping holes that stared out at nothing. This was the moment of despair. The town was right. Mr. Gable was right. Liam, her loving, dreaming Liam, had been a fool. The sight of the wreck was a physical blow. Her knees felt weak, the weight of the tools suddenly impossible. A raw, ragged sob escaped her throat, torn from her by the wind. Burro nudged her hand with his cold nose, whining in sympathy. For a long, bleak moment, she stood there, a tiny figure against an enormous, brutal sky, and believed she was doomed. This was not a home. It was a grave. The sun began to dip below the far peaks, painting the sky in cruel, beautiful shades of orange and purple. The temperature dropped like a stone. Cold was no longer a sensation. It was an enemy, a living thing that sought to invade her bones. She knew she could not spend the night in the open. With a shuddering breath, she forced her legs to move, scrambling up the loose scree toward the railcar. She had to see inside. She pulled herself up through a shattered window opening, her hands scraping against rusted metal. The inside was a hollow, echoing shell. Filth and debris littered the floor. The wind screamed through the broken windows, a mournful, constant howl. It was colder inside than out. She stood in the gathering gloom, the last of her hope draining away. And then she felt it, a subtle, almost imperceptible difference. While the wind howled through the upper half of the car, the air near the floor was strangely still. She knelt, her frozen fingers touching the warped wooden floorboards. It was there, a faint, steady current of air rising from below. But it was not cold. It was warm. Not hot, but distinctly, miraculously warm, like a sleeping animal's breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed her cheek to the floor, ignoring the grime. The warmth was real. It was a gentle, constant presence. She scrambled back outside, her despair forgotten, replaced by a frantic, desperate curiosity. She circled the buried end of the car, Burro digging beside her with his paws. She clawed at the dirt and loose rock packed against the car's underbelly. The warmth was stronger here. It was breathing from the earth itself. Liam had not been a fool. He had been observant. He must have found this. He must have known. The bluff wasn't just a piece of worthless rock. The railcar wasn't just a wreck. It was situated directly over a geothermal fissure, a deep crack in the earth that allowed the planet's inner heat to seep toward the surface. It was a secret gift, a hidden promise. The despair that had frozen her moments before melted away, replaced by a grim, blazing resolve. The town saw a tomb. She saw an opportunity. This place would not be her grave. It would be her forge. The work began before the sun was fully risen the next day. The first task was to excavate. The shovel was her weapon, the earth her adversary. For days she dug, her world shrinking to the scrape of steel on rock, the rhythmic thud of dirt thrown aside. She dug along the buried side of the railcar, exposing its steel frame, creating a trench between the car and the hillside. The muscles in her back and shoulders screamed, then hardened into taut ropes. Blisters formed on her palms, broke, and bled. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat and kept digging. Boro watched, a silent sentinel, occasionally digging with a frenzy of his own, as if to help. As she cleared the earth, she sorted the rock. Large, flat stones were set aside for walls, smaller rocks for fill. The soil itself was a revelation. Sheltered by the bluff, the dirt in the ravine below was rich and dark. She had found more than just heat. She had found life. With the trench dug, she began to build. She hauled the flat stones, each one a dead weight that strained her arms, and began to lay a foundation. It was slow, agonizing work. She had no mortar yet, so she fitted them together like pieces of a puzzle, using smaller stones to wedge them tight. She built a retaining wall in the trench, transforming it from a ditch into a sheltered walkway along the side of the car. This wall would block the wind and trap the earth's heat against the car's steel skin. Next came the railcar itself. It was a sieve, riddled with rust holes and gaps. She needed mortar, and she found it in the ravine. A thick seam of gray clay ran along the base of a rock outcropping. She spent a day digging it out, mixing it with water from a snow-fed seep she'd found, and adding dried grass for a binder. The resulting daub was thick and heavy. For a week, she worked like a plasterer, forcing the clay mixture into every hole, every seam, every crack. Her hands were caked in it, her fingernails broken. She chinked the gaps around the window frames she'd crudely patched with salvaged boards. She slathered a thick layer along the base of the car, sealing it to the stone foundation she had built. The wind's mournful song inside the car began to quiet, first to a whisper, then to silence. The heart of her new home would be its fire. Using the very best stones, she built a hearth against the interior wall, directly over the warmest spot on the floor. The stones would absorb the heat from the fire and the geothermal warmth from below, creating a massive thermal battery that would radiate warmth long after the flames died down. For the chimney, she painstakingly built a stone flue that vented up and through the railcar's roof. It was the hardest part of the construction. Twice, her clumsy stonework collapsed, but on the third try, it held. She sealed the main doors shut, building a stone buttress against them on the outside. Her entrance would be a small, heavy door she fashioned from thick planks at the more sheltered end of the car. It was low and narrow, designed to keep the heat in. She now had a box, a sealed, insulated, stone-fortified box. The first fire was a sacred moment. She laid the kindling and small logs with reverent care. With her flint and steel, she struck a spark. A tiny flame flickered, caught, and grew. Smoke billowed for a moment, and her heart sank. But then the draft from the fissure and the new chimney took hold, pulling the smoke cleanly upward. The fire roared to life. Warmth, real, penetrating warmth, filled the small space. She sat on the floor, her back against the warming stones of the hearth, and watched the flames dance. Boro lay beside her, sighing with a contentment so deep it was almost human. For the first time since Liam's death, she felt a flicker of something that was not grief or fear. It was the quiet, fierce pride of creation. It worked. But shelter and heat were not enough. She needed water and food. The seep she'd found at the base of the bluff was reliable. She spent 2 days digging it out, creating a small pool. She lined the entire basin with a thick layer of her gray clay, packing it down until it was watertight. This created a small cistern that would hold the precious water, keeping it clean. She built a low stone wall around it and a flat stone lid to keep out debris. One system connected to another. Food was the greatest challenge. Winter was coming on fast. But she had a secret weapon, the constant, gentle heat rising from the ground. On the leeward side of the railcar, sheltered by her new wall, the ground was not only frost-free, it was warm to the touch. This would be her garden. She constructed a low, U-shaped stone wall, about 2 feet high, against the side of the railcar. She spent 4 punishing days hauling the rich, dark soil from the ravine floor to fill it, bucket by bucket. It was back-breaking labor that left her gasping for breath, her body aching with an exhaustion so deep it felt like a kind of numbness. For the final piece, she used the few intact shards of glass from the railcar's windows. She painstakingly pieced them together into a crude but functional lid for her raised bed, creating a cold frame. It was a nursery, a tiny ecosystem warmed from below by the earth and from above by the low winter sun, protected from the wind and snow. A place where life could persist in the face of death. With her shelter established and her garden bed prepared, she knew she had to return to town. She needed seeds, and she needed livestock. The thought of facing those people again, of walking into Gable's mercantile, filled her with a cold dread, but it had to be done. She left at dawn, Boro at her side, the $2.50 clutched in her hand. The walk back to Providence Gulch felt different. The land was no longer just a hostile wilderness. It was a place of stone and clay and water, resources she now understood. She walked with a new purpose, her stride firm, her gaze direct. The town was a shock. After the silence of the bluff, the noise of voices, wagons, and hammers felt overwhelming. People stopped and stared as she walked down the main street. Her clothes were stained with mud and clay, her hair was wild, her face was smudged with soot, but her eyes were clear and hard. She was not the broken widow who had left weeks ago. The bell on the mercantile door sounded her arrival. The store was warm and crowded. The conversation stopped. All eyes turned to her. Mr. Gable was behind the counter, tallying a ledger. He looked up, and his face tightened, the lines around his mouth deepening. He saw her, not as a pitiable wretch, but as a ghost he had failed to exorcise. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Seeds," Elara said, her own voice steady. "Turnips, carrots, kale, and a sack of cracked corn." A ripple of murmurs went through the store. Seeds. In late October, it was madness. Brant, the trapper, was there, leaning against a barrel. He let out a short, barking laugh. "Gonna plant a crop of icicles, are you, girl?" Elara ignored him. She looked directly at Mr. Gable. He hesitated, then slowly turned and began to measure out her requests. As he worked, she added one more item. "And 4 laying hens." This time, the laughter was open. The idea was absurd. Chickens wouldn't last a week in the open on the bluff. But her money was good. Mr. Gable took her coins without looking at her. His son Thomas was sent to fetch the chickens, which he placed in a burlap sack. The boy wouldn't meet her eyes. The walk back was a strange procession. Elara, with her axe and shovel, now supplemented by a sack of corn over one shoulder, and a squawking, wriggling bag of chickens in her hand. She had become a spectacle, a piece of town folklore, before she had even survived her first snow. They had a new name for her now. She heard it whispered as she left the store. The boxcar witch, they called her. Living in a metal coffin, planting seeds in the snow. They thought her insane. Let them, she thought. Their ignorance was its own kind of cage. Back at the bluff, she built a small, sturdy coop for the chickens. She built it against the warmest part of her foundation wall, where the geothermal heat was strongest. She packed the walls with dried grass for insulation and made sure it was predator-proof. The chickens, once released, clucked and scratched in their new home, seemingly content. That evening, under the fragile glass of her cold frame, Elara planted her seeds in the warm, dark earth. It was an act of faith, a quiet rebellion against the coming cold. She was not planting for today or for tomorrow. She was planting for the deep winter, for the heart of the freeze. She was building a life, not from what she was given, but from what others had thrown away. The first real snows came in November, a thick white blanket that muffled the world in silence. The mockery from the town faded into the distance, replaced by the profound solitude of the bluff. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the railcar and the small circle of life she tended around it. Her days fell into a simple, powerful rhythm. She would wake before dawn in the deep, steady warmth of her shelter. The stones of the hearth were always warm to the touch. She would add a few logs to the fire, the crackle of the flames a friendly voice in the quiet. Outside, the world was a canvas of white and gray, the wind a constant, keening presence. But inside her metal shell, all was calm. Her first task was always the animals. The chickens, snug in their geothermally heated coop, would greet her with soft clucks. To her astonishment and deep satisfaction, they continued to lay 4 precious brown eggs nearly every day. They were a miracle, a testament to the life-giving warmth of the earth. She would feed them their corn, check their water, and collect the eggs as if they were jewels. Next was the garden. She would lift the glass lid of her cold frame to be met with a puff of warm, humid air that smelled of living soil. And there, in the dead of winter, was a splash of impossible green. The kale was thriving, its leaves dark and hardy. The tops of her carrots and turnips were lush and vibrant. The warmth from below was working. She tended the small plot with a fierce, maternal devotion, watering it with melted snow, pulling the occasional weed. The rest of the day was a cycle of maintenance. She chopped firewood, hauling logs she had felled from the sparse woods in the ravine. She checked the seals on the railcar, plugging any new drafts with her clay daub. She cleared snow from her path to the cistern and from the roof of the cold frame. She set a small line of snares in the ravine, occasionally catching a rabbit, which provided a welcome addition of meat to her diet of eggs and stored grains. Boro was her constant companion. He slept at the foot of her cot, a warm, breathing presence in the dark. He stood guard while she worked, his sharp barks alerting her to a passing deer or a curious coyote. His loyalty was an unspoken comfort, a living link to the husband she had lost and the life they had dreamed of. In the deep silence of the winter, his companionship was everything. Once, Brant, the trapper, came by on his snowshoes, his curiosity getting the better of him. He circled her settlement, his face a mask of disbelief. He saw the wisp of smoke from her chimney, the solid stone walls, the faint green under the glass. He shouted a mocking question at her, his voice thin against the wind. "How's that winter crop, witch?" Elara was inside, kneading dough for bread. She heard him, but she did not answer. She simply continued her work. Her life was the only answer she needed to give. He eventually left, shaking his head, no doubt with a fine story to tell back at the mercantile. The isolation was a test, but it was also a purification. The noise of the world, its judgments and its expectations, was stripped away. All that was left was the truth of her own 2 hands, the reliability of the systems she had built, and the quiet, steady beat of her own heart. She was not just surviving, she was sovereign in her small kingdom of warmth and life. A small blizzard came in early December, a preview of what was to come. For 3 days, the snow fell and the wind howled. She did not leave the railcar. Her firewood held. Her food stores were ample. The structures stood firm. The storm was a test, and she had passed. She was ready. Or so she thought. The great freeze arrived in the second week of January. It did not come like a storm, with howling winds and driving snow. It descended like a judgment, a silent, predatory thing that sucked the heat from the very air. The sky turned a strange, pale, crystalline blue. The sun was a useless ornament in the sky, offering light but no warmth. The temperature plummeted, first to 20 below zero, then 30, then an unthinkable 40. The old-timers in Providence Gulch had never seen its like. They called it the still freeze, a cold so profound it felt like the world itself was dying. Inside her railcar, Ilara felt the change. The cold was a palpable pressure against her walls. The fire in her hearth, which had always been more for comfort than necessity, now became critical. She fed it constantly, the small stove glowing a dull red. The thermal mass of the stones worked tirelessly, absorbing the fire's heat and the earth's warmth, fighting back against the lethal chill. The air inside was cool, but it was survivable. The chickens were huddled together in their coop, but they were alive. The plants in her garden were wilted at the edges, but their roots, deep in the warm soil, were safe. Her shelter, the thing the town had mocked as a folly, was holding. In Providence Gulch, the world was breaking. The town was built of wood, designed for ordinary winters. It was not prepared for this. The first thing to fail was the firewood. Families who thought they had enough for 2 winters found their entire stock consumed in a matter of days. The cold was a hungry beast, devouring fuel at an impossible rate. Then the structures themselves began to fail. The extreme cold made seasoned timber as brittle as glass. Nails contracted, popping from boards with loud cracks that echoed like gunshots in the frozen air. Roofs sagged. Walls split open, letting the killing cold inside. The great stone chimney of the meeting hall, the town's designated emergency shelter, developed a fracture from top to bottom. It was no longer safe to light a fire within it. The town's well, the central artery of its life, froze solid 3 feet down. Livestock, even those sheltered in barns, began to die, their bodies discovered frozen solid in their stalls. People huddled in their homes, wrapping themselves in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in their own kitchens. The community's confidence, its rugged frontier self-assurance, shattered. They were trapped, and they were freezing to death. Mr. Gable's vast mercantile, with its stores of goods, was as cold as a tomb. His wealth was useless against a cold that stole the very breath from your lungs. His own granddaughter was sick, a feverish child now shivering uncontrollably in a house that could no longer hold out the cold. Ilara knew nothing of this. Her world was the steady hum of survival. She moved with calm, deliberate purpose, rationing her wood, tending her systems. The contrast was absolute. Outside her walls, a world of lethal, crystalline silence. Inside, the crackle of a fire, the soft clucking of chickens, the smell of damp earth, the sound of her own steady breathing. She was not fighting the freeze. She had built a world where the freeze could not reach. The arrival came on the 3rd day of the freeze. Boro began to bark, a deep, frantic sound he only used for real alarms. Ilara grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and cracked open her small, sturdy door. The cold that rushed in was a physical blow, stinging her face and lungs. At first, she saw nothing but a landscape of white, alien and hostile under the pale sun. Then she saw movement. A figure, stumbling, falling, crawling through the deep snow. It was a man, barely recognizable, his clothes frozen stiff, his face a mask of ice and desperation. Boro ran to him, barking, nudging the frozen form. The figure collapsed 50 feet from her door and did not move again. Ilara did not hesitate. She wrapped her thickest shawl around her head and plunged into the cold. The air was so frigid, it felt like breathing shards of glass. She reached the man, grabbing his frozen coat. It was Brant, the trapper. The man who had laughed at her, who had called her a witch. His eyes were barely open, the pupils tiny dots in a face drained of all color. This was the moment of choice. The memory of his mocking laughter in the mercantile was sharp and clear. The bitter taste of public humiliation. She could leave him. No one would ever know. It would be justice. The cold would claim him, as it was claiming the rest of the town that had scorned her. But as she looked down at his frost-blackened fingers and the ice crystals in his beard, she saw not a mocker, but a man at the edge of death. Helping him would cost her. It would tax her precious firewood, her carefully rationed food, her own safety. The choice was not a choice at all. She could not be the thing they thought she was. With a grunt of effort, she heaved Brant's arm over her shoulder. "Boro, help!" she commanded. The dog understood, grabbing a piece of Brant's stiff coat in his teeth and pulling. Together, woman and dog, they began the agonizingly slow process of dragging the half-frozen man back to the warmth of the railcar. It was a rescue, an act of defiance against the cold and against the part of herself that craved vengeance. Getting him inside was a battle against his own dead weight and the crushing cold. She finally managed to haul him through the door and slam it shut, sealing out the deathly air. He was a block of ice on her floor. She worked with frantic energy, cutting away his frozen clothes with a skinning knife. His skin was waxy and white, his feet and hands a terrifying shade of gray. Frostbite, deep and severe. She wrapped him in every blanket she had, piling them on top of him near the hearth, but not too near. She knew from old tales that warming a frozen man too quickly could kill him. She melted snow and forced lukewarm water between his chapped, blue lips. For hours she tended to him, a grim, silent nurse. He was delirious, muttering about his trap lines, about the cold, about the town. He spoke of children crying, of Mr. Gable's granddaughter, Amelia, burning with fever in a frozen room. The town was dying. Brant woke hours later. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. The first thing he registered was the warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to rise from the floorboards and radiate from the stones beside him. He blinked, his vision clearing. He saw the stone hearth, the steady fire, the neatly stacked firewood. He heard the impossible sound of chickens clucking softly from a corner. His gaze drifted to the other side of the room, and he saw it. A splash of green. Living plants, under glass, growing in the dark heart of the freeze. His mind could not process it. The sensory information contradicted everything he knew about the world. He was in the boxcar witch's hovel, the town joke. But it was not a hovel. It was a haven. It was the warmest place he had been in a month. He stared at Alara, who was stirring a pot of broth over the fire. Her face was calm, her movements efficient. She was not a witch. She was a builder, an architect of survival. He tried to sit up, a groan of pain escaping his lips. "My feet," he rasped. "They're bad," Alara said simply, not looking at him. "But you will keep them." Shame washed over him, a heat more intense than the fire. He remembered his laughter, his smug certainty. He remembered calling her a fool. He looked at the impossible green of the garden, at the sturdy walls that held the lethal cold at bay, at the woman who had dragged him from his own grave. The truth settled on him with crushing weight. "We were wrong," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We called you a fool." "My God," he said, his eyes filling with tears of pain and shame. "We were the fools." He told her everything. The cracked chimney, the frozen well, the dying livestock, the families huddled in the dark, the sick children. "They're going to die, all of them," he choked out. "Gable's little girl. She won't last the night." Alara listened, her expression unreadable. Here was her vindication. The town that had cast her out was now on its knees, and she was the only one standing. She could have savored the moment. She could have reminded him of his cruelty, of their judgment. She could have said, "I told you so." She did none of those things. Her victory was not in their defeat, but in her own resilience. Her grace was in her strength. She simply nodded, her jaw set. She ladled a bowl of hot rabbit stew and handed it to him. "There is food. Eat," she commanded. Then she turned and began to prepare. She gathered a dozen eggs, wrapping each one carefully in cloth. She went to her winter garden and pulled up carrots and turnips from the warm earth. She packed a small wooden box with dried meat and hardtack bread. From her precious woodpile, she selected the driest, most potent logs and bundled them with rope. She filled a sealed pail with hot broth. She did not act like a savior or a conqueror. She acted like a woman with work to do. She loaded everything onto a small, sturdy sled she had built for hauling wood. She looked at Brant, who was watching her, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Stay by the fire," she said. "I will be back." She pulled on her heaviest wraps, called for Boro, and opened the door to face the killing cold once more. The journey to Providence Gulch was a descent into a frozen hell. The wind, armed with ice crystals, scoured her exposed skin like a wire brush. But Ilara and Boro moved with purpose, two living sparks in a dead world. They arrived in the town as the last of the pale light was failing. It was a ghost town, silent and still, the houses like dark, frozen tombs. The first person to see her was Thomas Gable, peering from a frosted window. His eyes went wide with shock. He saw not the pitiful widow his father had exiled, but a figure of impossible strength emerging from the heart of the storm with a sled laden with food and firewood, a silent dog at her side. Ilara did not go to the meeting hall. She did not go to the mercantile. She walked directly to Mr. Gable's house, the largest in town. She did not knock. She kicked the door open. The scene inside was desperate. Mr. Gable, his wife, and a few servants were huddled around a single, sputtering tallow lamp, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The air was frigid. In a small bed in the corner, a little girl was shivering violently, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Mr. Gable scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of fury and astonishment. "What is the meaning of this?" he began, his voice weak. Ilara looked through him, as if he were a pane of glass. She walked past him to his wife, placing the bundle of firewood on the floor. "For the girl," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the authority of one who had mastered the storm. She handed the woman the box of eggs and food and the pail of hot broth. "Feed her." Then she turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. She went to the next house and the next, distributing what little she had, directing the strongest survivors in small, manageable groups toward the impossible warmth of her shelter. "Follow my tracks," she told them. "Do not stop. There is heat." When the great freeze finally broke a week later, Providence Gulch was a changed place. Nearly a third of its livestock was gone, and many of the buildings were damaged beyond repair. But the people had survived. They had survived because the woman they had mocked and cast out had shown them the way. In the aftermath, the community's relationship with Ilara was transformed. The derisive nickname, the Boxcar Witch, was never spoken again. Instead, they called her settlement Ilara's Hearth. People did not come to stare anymore. They came to learn. They came with questions, with offerings of trade, with a new and profound respect. Mr. Gable's power was broken. His wealth had failed him. His authority, built on money and intimidation, had crumbled in the face of a cold he could not buy or bully. He tried to apologize to Ilara once, approaching her with his head bowed, but she simply met his gaze with her clear, steady eyes and walked away. His shame was his own to carry. The story of Ilara's Hearth spread through the territory. travelers carried the tale of the widow who had built a home warmed by the earth itself, who grew a garden in the snow. Her methods, once seen as madness, were now recognized as genius. When the people of Providence Gulch rebuilt, they rebuilt differently. They built with stone and earth. They dug their foundations deeper, seeking the planet's warmth. They learned to build thermal mass into their hearths. The town, chastened and humbled, became more resilient, better prepared for the harsh realities of the land. A year later, Ilara stood on the edge of her bluff, looking out over the ravine. Her garden was expanded, a lush patch of green thriving against the side of the railcar. A small herd of goats, traded for her knowledge, grazed nearby. Her home was no longer just a shelter. It was a homestead, a symbol of what could be built not just from scraps, but from courage and ingenuity. She was no longer an outcast. She was a founder, a quiet leader who had remade her world through the force of her will. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the landscape, and she felt a profound, unshakable peace. She had built more than a home. She had built a life.